Imagine being born into a palace where your future has already been negotiated. You have never met the man you are supposed to marry. You may not even be old enough to understand what marriage means. But somewhere in a royal chamber, men have already decided your fate. Your marriage could secure an alliance, stop a war, transfer a kingdom, produce an heir. And refusing could mean rebellion, imprisonment, or death. For royal women, marriage was rarely just about love. It was diplomacy written in bloodlines. Yet throughout history, a remarkable group of queens refused to remain pieces on somebody else's political chessboard. Some demanded an annulment. Some escaped abusive husbands. Some rejected powerful suitors. And some discovered something far more dangerous than rebellion. They could use their own royal authority to fight back. Their stories take us from medieval Georgia to England, from the courts of Iberia to the turbulent kingdoms of Europe. And in several cases, the woman who was supposed to become somebody's wife eventually became the person ruling the kingdom herself. But what really happened? For much of medieval Europe, marriage was one of the most powerful political weapons available. Kings married daughters to secure treaties. Dynasties married cousins to preserve territory. A princess could become the human guarantee of an alliance. And once the ceremony happened, escaping the marriage was extraordinarily difficult. There was no modern concept of simply walking away. Church law, royal politics, inheritance, and military power could all stand in the way. That makes the stories of these women extraordinary. Because they weren't simply escaping husbands. They were challenging systems designed to make escape almost impossible. One of the clearest examples came from 12th century Georgia. Her name was Tamar. And she would eventually become one of the most powerful monarchs in Georgian history. But before she became known as Tamar the Great, she faced a political marriage that nearly destroyed her reign. Tamar became Queen of Georgia in 1184. She was young, enormously powerful, and surrounded by nobles who wanted to control the monarchy. The Georgian aristocracy wanted influence over the new queen. And one of their solutions was marriage. Tamar was married to Yuri, a prince from the Rus territories. The marriage was politically useful. But it quickly became disastrous. Contemporary and near-contemporary Georgian sources describe Yuri as a violent and deeply troubled figure, although historians caution that these accounts were written from Tamar's political perspective and may exaggerate his faults. Whatever the exact reality, the marriage collapsed. And Tamar did something remarkable. She sought a divorce. In medieval Christian Europe, ending a royal marriage was not a simple personal decision. It required religious and political justification. Tamar's court presented grounds for separation, and the marriage was dissolved. But that wasn't the end. Yuri attempted to return to Georgia with military support and challenged Tamar's authority. The queen defeated him. The woman who had supposedly needed a husband to stabilize her throne had instead become powerful enough to defeat her former husband on the battlefield. And then came the twist. Tamar remarried, but this time, the political balance was different. She married David Soslan, a military commander and nobleman who became her trusted political and military partner. Under Tamar, Georgia entered what historians traditionally regard as its medieval golden age. Its territory expanded. Its armies defeated major rivals. Its cultural influence flourished. The queen who had escaped one politically imposed marriage became the ruler of an expanding kingdom. But Tamar was not the only royal woman to discover that marriage could become a battlefield. Hundreds of miles west, another queen faced a similar problem. Her name was Urraca of Leon and Castile. And her marriage would help plunge an entire kingdom into chaos. Urraca became queen in 1109 after the death of her father, Alfonso VI. She was already a widow. But almost immediately, the political elite sought to determine whom she would marry next. The choice was Alfonso I of Aragon, a powerful warrior king. On paper, it looked brilliant. 2 kingdoms. 2 rulers. 1 marriage. But reality was very different. the relationship quickly became bitter. The sources describe conflict, accusations, violence, and competing political factions. And the marriage created a constitutional nightmare. Who actually held authority? Urraca? Alfonso? Could one ruler command the other's territories? The marriage was eventually declared invalid by the church on grounds related to their close kinship. But historians debate how much the religious argument reflected genuine canonical concerns and how much it was driven by political necessity. Either way, Urraca refused to disappear. The kingdom descended into conflict. Her husband tried to impose his authority. Urraca's supporters resisted. Castles changed hands. Nobles switched sides. And the marriage that was supposed to unite kingdoms instead helped fracture them. Urraca eventually secured her position as ruler. She was not simply somebody's wife. She was Queen of Leon and Castile in her own right. And her survival mattered. Because her son, Alfonso VII, would later become one of the most powerful rulers of medieval Iberia. But there was another queen whose story shows just how dangerous royal marriage negotiations could become. Her name was Jadwiga. Today she is remembered as a saint and is one of Poland's most important medieval rulers. But as a child, her marriage had already been planned. Jadwiga was born in 1373 or 1374 into the Hungarian branch of the Angevin dynasty. As a young girl, she was associated with a marriage agreement involving William of Austria. The arrangement was political, as royal marriages usually were. But as Jadwiga grew older, the political situation around Poland changed dramatically. Polish nobles wanted a different alliance. Their attention turned toward Jogaila, the pagan Grand Duke of Lithuania. A marriage between Jadwiga and Jogaila could create an enormous political transformation. Lithuania could move toward Christianity. Poland could gain a powerful ally. And a new Polish-Lithuanian political relationship could emerge. But there was a problem. Jadwiga had already been associated with William. Later stories claim she tried to reach William at Wawel Castle and even attempted to break through a gate. It is one of the most dramatic episodes in her biography. But historians treat the story cautiously. The surviving evidence does not allow us to know exactly what happened. What we do know is that the marriage with William did not take place. Jadwiga ultimately married Jogaila in 1386. And the consequences were enormous. She became Queen of Poland. Jogaila became king. Their marriage helped establish a political union between Poland and Lithuania that would shape Eastern European history for centuries. The woman whose childhood marriage negotiations seemed to make her a political pawn became one of the key figures in creating a powerful new political order. And then there was another queen whose escape from marriage changed the map of Western Europe. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was not an ordinary princess. She inherited one of the largest and wealthiest territories in medieval Europe. In 1137, she married Louis VII of France. The marriage had obvious political value. Eleanor's lands were enormously important. But the relationship deteriorated. The couple participated in the Second Crusade, and their marriage became increasingly strained. There were disputes over succession, politics, and their relationship. They had daughters, but no surviving male heir. And Eleanor increasingly found herself trapped inside a marriage that was no longer serving her interests. In 1152, after years of conflict, the marriage was annulled on grounds of prohibited kinship. Again, historians emphasize that medieval annulments were complicated. This was not a modern divorce. The church technically declared that a valid marriage had never existed. But politically, the result was revolutionary. Eleanor walked away from the French king. And then she did something almost unbelievable. She married Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was 11 years younger than her. 2 years later, he became King Henry II of England. Suddenly Eleanor's enormous territories became connected to the English crown. Her former husband controlled France. Her new husband controlled England and vast territories in France. And Eleanor herself remained one of the most powerful women in Europe. The marriage eventually became turbulent too. Henry and Eleanor had 8 children. Their sons later rebelled against their father, and Eleanor herself supported the rebellion. Henry imprisoned her for years. So Eleanor's escape from one royal marriage did not lead to freedom in the modern sense. It led to another struggle for power. But she had achieved something extraordinary. She had refused to remain permanently attached to the political future chosen for her. And she became the mother of kings, including Richard the Lionheart and King John of England. But perhaps the most fascinating example is not a queen who escaped a marriage. It is a queen who escaped the entire expectation that she had to marry at all. Elizabeth I of England. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, marriage was one of the most dangerous political questions surrounding her reign. England expected a monarch to produce an heir. Foreign kings wanted her hand. Domestic politicians demanded certainty about the succession. Every potential husband represented a political threat. If Elizabeth married a foreign prince, England might become entangled with another power. If she married an English nobleman, that man could gain enormous influence. And if she married nobody? The dynasty could die with her. Elizabeth understood the trap. Throughout her reign, marriage negotiations repeatedly appeared and disappeared. She allowed discussions to continue when it served her diplomatic interests. But she never surrendered control. One of the most famous candidates was Francis, Duke of Anjou. The negotiations became serious enough to alarm many of Elizabeth's subjects. Yet the marriage never happened. Elizabeth remained unmarried. Her famous image as the Virgin Queen became central to her political identity. But there is an important historical distinction. Elizabeth was not literally escaping a forced marriage in the same way Tamar escaped Uri. She was resisting immense political and social pressure to marry. And that distinction matters. Because sometimes the most powerful act of resistance was simply refusing to give someone else control of the succession. Elizabeth turned her unmarried status into political power. She could negotiate with European monarchs without actually giving them a husbandly claim over her government. She could remain the final authority. And when she died in 1603, she left behind one of the most famous reigns in English history. But that wasn't the whole story. Across these royal courts, marriage was supposed to control women. Yet these queens repeatedly discovered another possibility. They could control the marriage. Or reject it. Or survive it. Or turn the political consequences to their own advantage. And the deeper we look, the stranger the system becomes. Because medieval queens were not simply victims of arranged marriage. Some absolutely were coerced. Some had very little choice. Some were married as children. Some endured abusive relationships. But others possessed enormous political resources of their own. Land. Titles. Armies. Dynastic legitimacy. Religious authority. And sometimes, the loyalty of powerful nobles. That meant the royal bride could become the most dangerous person in the room. Tamar used political authority to remove a disastrous husband and defeat his attempt to return. Urraca survived a disastrous marriage and maintained her claim to the throne. Jadwiga's marriage became part of a transformation that connected Poland and Lithuania. Eleanor escaped her first royal marriage and entered an even greater political alliance. Elizabeth refused to allow marriage to determine who controlled England. Their stories are different. Their societies were different. And their freedom was never absolute. That is perhaps the most important lesson. These women did not suddenly live in a world where women could freely choose their destiny. They lived in worlds that were overwhelmingly controlled by dynasties, churches, armies, fathers, husbands, and male political elites. Their victories were exceptional precisely because the system was so difficult to escape. And sometimes, the escape itself came with a price. Tamar faced civil conflict. Urraca endured political chaos. Eleanor was eventually imprisoned by her own husband. Elizabeth spent decades under pressure over the succession. Power could protect these women. But power could also isolate them. Perhaps that is why their stories survived. Because the most fascinating royal scandal is not always the marriage itself. Sometimes it is the moment when the bride realizes that the political system expects obedience. And decides to become the political system's greatest problem. A princess was supposed to secure an alliance. A queen was supposed to produce heirs. A wife was supposed to strengthen her husband's power. But these women demonstrated something their contemporaries could not easily control. A royal marriage could create political power, but it could also create a woman powerful enough to escape it. And centuries later, that may be the most remarkable part of their stories. They were born into a world where their marriages were negotiated for them. Yet some of them managed to negotiate history itself. So when we look back at these queens, we should ask ourselves, were they simply lucky enough to possess extraordinary power, or were they exceptionally skilled at using the little freedom their world gave them? And perhaps the darker question is even more revealing. How many other royal women tried to escape forced marriages, but never had enough power to make history remember their names? Because behind every famous queen who escaped the cage, there may have been hundreds of women who never found the door. And that is the part of royal history we still know far too little about.